It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Give me the heirloom veil, Sienna snapped. You don't have a husband or a future to wear it for anyway. The words hung in the air of the bridal boutique, clashing with the soft, melodic piano music playing in the background. Sterling-Thorne stood on the circular pedestal, a mountain of ivory silk and hand-stitched pearls cascading around her. She looked like a princess, but her expression was one of pure, sharpened greed. Elena Vance felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She sat on the velvet settee, her fingers instinctively brushing the worn leather of her briefcase. Inside, tucked away in a silk pouch, was the Belgian lace veil that had belonged to her mother, the only thing Elena had left of the woman who had died when she was 10. That veil isn't part of the wedding budget, Sienna, Elena said, her voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in her heart. It's a family heirloom, my mother's heirloom. Sienna rolled her eyes, catching her reflection in the triptych of floor-to-ceiling mirrors. She adjusted the bodice of her $20,000 gown, her movements jerky and entitled. And I'm the one actually getting married into the Sterling family. Do you have any idea what Maximilian Sterling expects? He wants tradition. He wants class. That veil is the only thing you own that actually fits the brief. Valerie Thorne, standing by the champagne cart, let out a delicate, practiced sigh. She smoothed her designer suit, the scent of expensive white lilies wafting from her skin. Elena, darling, don't be difficult. Sienna is marrying into the most powerful family in the city. Think of the prestige this brings to all of us. Surely your mother would have wanted her lace to be seen at the wedding of the season, rather than rotting in a cedar chest in your cramped apartment. Elena looked toward her father. Richard Vance stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the street below, refusing to meet his daughter's eyes. He looked older, diminished by the shadow of his second wife's ambition. "Dad," Elena asked softly. Richard cleared his throat but didn't turn around. "It's just a piece of fabric, Elena. If it helps your sister have her special day, isn't that worth more than a memory? Let's just have one afternoon without a scene." The betrayal stung more than Sienna's insults. Elena was the one who had stayed by his side during the lean years. She was the one who had worked 3 jobs to put herself through law school, while Valerie was busy spending his dwindling savings on social investments. Now she was a senior contract arbitrator, a woman who spent her days dissecting the fine print of multi-million-dollar deals. Yet in this room, she was still treated like an unwanted guest at her own table. Sienna stepped off the pedestal, the heavy silk of her dress rustling like a warning. She marched over to Elena, her hand outstretched. "Give it to me, now. I need the seamstress to see if the ivory matches." "No," Elena said, Sienna's face contorted. The pretty mask she wore for her 100,000 followers slipped, revealing the jagged edge of her temper. "You're a glorified paper pusher, Elena. You spend your life in a cubicle looking at boring documents while I'm about to become a Sterling. You owe me this. You owe this family for letting you tag along for all these years." She reached for Elena's bag, her manicured nails catching on the leather. Elena pulled the bag back, standing up with a sudden, sharp grace that made Sienna stumble. "I don't owe you anything," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "And if you touch my property again, you'll find out exactly how a paper pusher handles a theft." Valerie gasped, dropping her crystal flute. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet boutique. "Richard, are you going to let her speak to Sienna like that?" But Elena wasn't looking at them anymore. Her eyes had fallen on the glass-topped table near the fitting rooms. Resting there was a thick, gold-embossed folder, the contract for the wedding venue at the Sterling estate. Sienna had been bragging about it for weeks, claiming she'd charmed Maximilian Sterling into giving them the royal treatment. Elena knew that contract. She knew it because she was the one who had spent the last 6 months drafting the new standard excellence and integrity protocols for the Sterling Group. She saw the signature line on the top page, visible through the glass. It wasn't signed by Maximilian yet. It was a draft, pending a final character review of the joining family. Maximilian Sterling was a man of old-world values. He believed that a marriage was a merger of character, not just assets. He had personally requested a morality clause that allowed for the immediate termination of all venue and catering contracts, without refund, if the conduct of the parties brought disrepute or moral stain upon the Sterling name. A small, cold smile touched Elena's lips. She reached into her bag and pulled out a professional red marker, the kind she used to bleed over bad contracts. "What are you doing?" Sienna demanded, her voice shrill. "Get away from my things." Elena didn't touch the folder. She didn't have to. She simply leaned over, memorizing the specific contract ID number printed in the corner of the page. She thought about the 3 witnesses in the room, the boutique assistants who were currently staring at Sienna's red-faced tantrum with poorly hidden disgust. "I was just thinking about the Sterling family values," Elena said, tucking the marker back into her bag. She looked at her father, then at the woman who had spent a decade trying to erase her mother's memory. "You're right, Sienna. Maximilian Sterling expects tradition and class." Elena picked up her briefcase and walked toward the door. The heavy glass handle felt cold in her hand. "Where are you going?" Richard called out, finally turning around. "Elena, wait." Elena paused at the threshold, the afternoon sun hitting her face. She felt a strange, soaring sense of calm. The sleeping lion wasn't just a nickname her colleagues gave her. It was a promise. "I have a lot of work to do," Elena said, her voice echoing in the posh space. "I need to review some very important clauses. After all, a contract is only as good as the people who sign it." As she stepped out onto the sidewalk, she pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number she knew by heart. It was the direct line to the Sterling Group's legal department. "This is Elena Vance," she said as the call connected. "I need to flag a high-priority integrity risk for the Sterling-Thorne wedding contract." "Yes, I'll be in the office in 20 minutes. She walked toward her modest car, leaving the sounds of Sienna's muffled screaming behind her. The countdown had begun, and Sienna Thorne had no idea she had just handed her sister the very weapon that would dismantle her golden future. That evening, the air in the Sterling Group's legal suite felt heavy with the scent of ozone and burnt coffee. Elena Vance sat alone at her mahogany desk, the only illumination coming from the blue glow of her dual monitors. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, steady and precise. On the screen, the Sterling-Thorne wedding contract was stripped bare, its clauses dissected like a specimen on a lab table. She wasn't just looking for a loophole, she was looking for the kill switch. The heavy glass door creaked open, and Marcus Henderson stepped in. The venue manager looked like a man who had spent the last 3 hours standing in a wind tunnel. His tie was loosened, and his face was a mask of professional exhaustion. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "The Thorne family is calling for your head, Elena," he said, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "Sienna spent the afternoon screaming at the catering staff that you're trying to sabotage the most important day of her life. She's demanding a formal apology and a signed statement that the venue is secured regardless of the minor, clerical errors you flagged." Elena didn't look up. "It's not a clerical error, Marcus. It's a breach of the Sterling Integrity Clause. Maximilian Sterling didn't build a multi-billion-dollar empire by partnering with people who treat contracts like suggestions. He values character. And right now, the Thorne family's character is looking remarkably bankrupt." She clicked a button, and a document slid out of the silent laser printer. She felt the thick, cream-colored paper, the tactile weight of a weapon. Marcus walked over, his eyes scanning the header. "You're playing with fire," he warned, though a small, appreciative smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Valerie Thorne has been calling every board member she knows. She's telling them you're mentally unstable after your divorce." "Let her talk," Elena replied softly. "The louder she is, the less she hears the ground shifting beneath her feet." 2 hours later, she arrived at the Vance family estate. The smell of expensive tuberose perfume hit her the moment she stepped into the foyer. Valerie's signature scent, cloying and aggressive. In the living room, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Sienna Thorne was draped across a velvet sofa, a damp cloth over her eyes, while Valerie Thorne paced the Persian rug like a caged panther. At the center of it all sat Richard Vance. He looked smaller than Elena remembered, his shoulders hunched as he nursed a glass of scotch. There she is, Valerie hissed, her eyes snapping to Elena. The girl who wants to destroy her own family for the sake of a few legal technicalities. Elena, please, Richard said, his voice thin and pleading. He didn't stand up to greet her. Sienna is hysterical. This wedding is the pinnacle of everything we've worked for. Just call the Sterling legal team and tell them you made a mistake. Tell them the integrity risk was a misunderstanding. Elena felt a sharp, cold prickle of adrenaline. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Dad. Sienna tried to sublease a venue she doesn't own to a third-party influencer for a behind-the-scenes special, violating the exclusivity agreement Maximilian Sterling signed personally. That's fraud. Sienna sat up, the cloth falling to the floor. Her face was blotchy, her eyes narrowed into slits. Who cares? It's just a room. You're just jealous because my life is perfect and yours is a pathetic pile of crumbs. You're a glorified secretary, Elena, you're nothing. Enough, Valerie snapped, stepping toward Elena. Her voice dropped to a low, venomous silk. Listen to me, you ungrateful girl. If you don't fix this by tomorrow morning, I will make sure your daughter's private school tuition fund is reallocated to cover the costs of the new venue. After all, family resources should go to the members who actually contribute, shouldn't they? The air in the room seemed to vanish. Elena's nails dug into her palms, but she didn't flinch. The sleeping lion wasn't just a name, it was a state of being. She looked at her father, waiting for him to defend his granddaughter, to say something, anything about the money Elena's own mother had left in trust. Richard looked away, staring into the amber depths of his glass. She's right, Elena. We have to think about the family's future. Don't be selfish. A strange, crystalline calm settled over Elena. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small digital recorder, clicking it off with a deliberate, audible snap. She had every word. The threat to her daughter, the admission of the fraud, the cold dismissal of her father. The wedding is in 72 hours, Elena said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. She turned toward the door, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I suggest you start looking for a dress that looks good in a deposition, Sienna, because the Sterling Group doesn't just cancel contracts, they dismantle the people who break them. She walked out into the night, the countdown echoing in her mind. 3 days. In 3 days, the Thorne family would realize that the woman they had spent years belittling was the one who held the keys to their kingdom, and she was about to lock the gates. 2 days later, the grand ballroom of the Sterling estate smelled of fresh floor wax and the frantic, cloying scent of 5,000 white lilies. Elena Vance stood on the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold iron railing as she watched the chaos below. It was 48 hours until the wedding, and the air was thick with the kind of tension that usually preceded a natural disaster. Down on the ballroom floor, Sienna Thorne was in the middle of a meltdown that had reduced a junior florist to tears. She snatched a bouquet of lilies from the girl's hands, her designer heels clicking like gunfire against the marble. I said cream, you idiot. These are ivory. Do you even have eyes, or did you spend your entire education looking at the clearance rack at a discount store? Elena watched her stepsister's face contort with a familiar, ugly entitlement. It was a mask of beauty stretched over a vacuum of character. Beside her, Valerie Thorne was nodding in approval, her eyes scanning the room for more perceived slights to their newfound status. Marcus, Valerie called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Marcus Henderson, where's that man? The venue manager appeared from behind a silk-draped pillar, his face a mask of professional exhaustion. He adjusted his glasses, his hands visibly trembling as he checked his tablet. Yes, Mrs. Thorne, is there a problem with the table settings? The problem, Marcus, is that this entire production feels budget, Valerie sneered, gesturing vaguely at the gold-leafed ceiling. We are joining the Sterling family. My daughter is about to become royalty in this city. I expect the staff to act like they aren't serving at a roadside diner. Sienna tossed the rejected lilies onto the floor, the delicate petals bruising against the stone. She looked up and finally spotted Elena on the balcony. A smirk replaced her scowl, one filled with a toxic brand of triumph. Oh, look, the charity case decided to show up. Come to see what a real life looks like, Elena. Or are you just here to beg Dad for more rent money before we cut you off for good? Elena didn't flinch. She didn't offer the satisfaction of a retort. She simply descended the stairs, her movements measured and silent. She felt the weight of the digital recorder in her handbag, the one containing every threat and confession from the night at the house. But more importantly, she felt the thin, plastic card tucked into her inner pocket, her Senior Arbitrator credentials for the Sterling Group. "I'm just here to check on the arrangements," she said calmly, her voice a sharp contrast to Sienna's screeching. "Check on the arrangements," Valerie laughed, a cold, rattling sound. "You're here because you're obsessed. You've always been jealous of Sienna. But let's be clear, you're a guest by technicality only. Richard and I have discussed it. You'll be seated in the back row, behind the pillars. We can't have your modest aesthetic ruining the wedding photos. Maximilian Sterling is very particular about his brand." "I'm sure he is," Elena replied. She turned her gaze to Marcus. The manager was staring at her, his eyes darting between her face and the Sterling crest on the wall. He looked like a man drowning, and Elena was the only one holding a rope. "Marcus, may I have a word in the office? I have some questions regarding the venue's liability clauses." Sienna rolled her eyes, checking her reflection in a silver tray. "Liability clauses? God, you're such a bore. Go play lawyer in the office, Elena. It's the only time you'll ever feel important. Just make sure you're out of here before the rehearsal dinner. We have actual dignitaries arriving, and you smell like—" "What is that? Generic soap." Elena ignored the jab and gestured for Marcus to lead the way. As they walked toward the back offices, she could hear Valerie telling the florist to clean up her mess and try to look less pathetic. Once the heavy oak door of the manager's office clicked shut, the silence felt like a physical weight. Marcus slumped into his chair, rubbing his temples. "Miss Vance, I apologize for the energy in the room. It's been a difficult week. If this is about your father's billing, I really can't." Elena didn't sit. She reached into her pocket and placed her Sterling Group ID on the desk. The gold holographic seal caught the light, shimmering with the authority of a billion-dollar empire. Marcus froze. He leaned forward, his eyes widening as he read the title, Senior Contract Arbitrator, Tier 1. He looked up at her, the color draining from his face until he was the same shade as the rejected lilies. You're with the corporate office, in the legal enforcement division." "I am," she said, her voice dropping into a professional chill. "And I've spent the last hour observing a series of gross violations of the Sterling Estate Conduct Code. Verbal abuse of staff, destruction of property, and a total lack of the integrity required for a Sterling-sanctioned event." Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I didn't know. They told me you were just the estranged daughter. They said you had no standing. They say a lot of things, Marcus. Most of them are lies." She leaned over the desk, her shadow falling across the wedding floor plans. "I want the master contract for the Thorne-Sterling wedding. Specifically, I want to see the moral turpitude and reputation clause. The one that allows the Sterling Group to terminate a contract without a refund if the client's behavior threatens the brand's prestige." Marcus's hands flew over his keyboard. "Clause 14, subsection B, it's a standard inclusion for high-profile events, but it's almost never invoked. It would require a direct order from the arbitrator's office." "Consider the order given," she said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "But we aren't pulling the plug yet. I want you to prepare the formal notice of intent to terminate. Keep it in your drafts. Do not notify the groom's father yet. I'll handle Maximilian Sterling myself." "What are you planning to do?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and budding hope. Elena looked toward the door, where the distant sound of Sienna's screaming could still be heard. "I'm going to let them keep spending. I want them to buy the dress, the catering, and the jewelry. I want them to feel like they've finally reached the top of the mountain." She turned back to Marcus, a cold, crystalline smile touching her lips. "Because the higher they climb, the more bones they'll break when Clause 14 hits the floor. We have 48 hours, Marcus. Make sure the cameras in the ballroom are recording everything. I want every insult, every tantrum, and every threat documented." She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the brass handle. "And Marcus, Tell the florist to take the rest of the day off. With pay, charge it to the Thorne account. They won't be needing that money where they're going. Elena stepped back into the hallway, the countdown in her head ticking louder than the grandfather clock in the foyer. 2 days. 2 days until the Thorne family realized that the woman they had treated like a shadow was actually the sun, and she was about to go dark. The morning of the final rehearsals, the estate grounds were already swarming with caterers and decorators. Elena stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her heels clicking softly against the polished Carrara marble. The air was thick with the cloying, suffocating scent of 5,000 imported white lilies, a floral wall that Sienna had insisted upon, despite the staggering cost. Elena watched as a worker struggled to stabilize a massive crystal centerpiece, the sharp screech of metal against stone echoing through the vaulted space like a warning. "Move it to the left," a sharp, familiar voice barked. Sienna Thorne swept into the room, her presence announced by the aggressive clicking of her designer stilettos and the trail of expensive, heavy perfume. She didn't look at the workers as people. She looked at them as extensions of her own will. Behind her, Valerie moved with a predatory grace, her eyes scanning the room for anything that didn't scream Billionaire's daughter. "It's a disaster," Sienna snapped, coming to a halt in front of Elena. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she handed Elena a half-empty, lukewarm latte cup as if she were a trash bin. "The lighting is too warm, I look jaundiced. Fix it." Elena held the cup, her fingers tightening around the cardboard. She didn't move. "The lighting was your specific request, Sienna. Changing it now would require a full crew reset." "Then get a full crew reset," Valerie interjected, her voice smooth and dangerous. She adjusted the collar of her silk blouse, her diamonds catching the morning sun. "Richard is already complaining about the budget, but we both know he'll pay whatever it takes to keep his little girl happy." "Right, Elena." Richard Vance appeared in the doorway then, looking frailer than he had only 2 days ago. He looked at the floral arrangements, then at the mounting invoices on the coordinator's table, and finally at his eldest daughter. There was a flicker of guilt in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by Valerie's sharp, expectant gaze. "Dad," Elena said, stepping toward him. She ignored the latte cup in her hand. "I need you to look at something, just 10 minutes. The final arbitration papers are in my bag. There's a discrepancy in the Thorne family trust merger that you need to see before the signing ceremony tomorrow." It was the final olive branch, a chance for her father to see the trap before it snapped shut. If he looked at the papers now, he could still pull back. He could save himself from the financial ruin that Valerie and Sienna were unknowingly sprinting toward. Richard hesitated, his hand reaching out. "Oh, don't bother him with work now, Elena," Sienna laughed, a high, brittle sound. She reached out and plucked the latte cup from Elena's hand, casually pouring the dregs of the milky liquid into the base of a nearby lily arrangement. "Tomorrow is about my future with Maximilian Sterling's son. It's about the Thorne name finally taking its rightful place. You're just upset because your name isn't on the guest list for the head table." Valerie stepped closer to Richard, looping her arm through his. "She's right, darling. Elena has always been a bit dramatic about paperwork. Let's go check on the vintage champagne delivery." Richard sighed, the weight of his weakness visible in the slump of his shoulders. "Not now, Elena. We'll talk after the wedding." He turned away, led by Valerie toward the kitchens. Elena stood alone in the center of the ballroom. She felt the vibration of her phone in her pocket, a message from Marcus Henderson. "Cameras 1 through 12 are live. Audio is crystalline. The Sterling legal team has received the pre-briefing. You should really read the fine print of the contracts you've been signing this week, Sienna," Elena said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Sometimes the most beautiful things have the sharpest edges." Sienna paused, her hand on her hip as she looked back over her shoulder. She looked at Elena's modest dress and her tired eyes, and her lip curled in a sneer of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Edges are for people who can't afford to smooth them out, Elena. By this time tomorrow, I'll be a Sterling, and you'll still be exactly what you've always been, a shadow." Sienna turned and marched away, shouting at a florist about the shade of the ribbons. Elena didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and touched the cold, stiff corner of the Clause 14 termination filing. Across the room, Marcus Henderson caught her eye. He gave a single, imperceptible nod. Everything was in place. The Thorne family had climbed to the very top of their mountain of greed, and they were currently admiring the view, completely unaware that Elena had already removed the ground from beneath their feet. She walked out of the ballroom, leaving the scent of lilies behind. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in hours. And as she stepped into the cool morning air, Elena Vance knew that by the time the sun set tomorrow, the shadows would be the only thing the Thorne family had left. The evening arrived with a suffocating elegance, the air inside the Sterling estate's glass conservatory smelling of forced orchids and expensive charcoal. Elena Vance stood near the perimeter, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool edge of the leather clutch that concealed the Clause 14 termination filing. She had traded her work blazer for a floor-length dress of charcoal silk, simple, architectural, and entirely devoid of the lace and sequins currently drowning her stepsister. Across the room, Sienna Thorne was holding court beneath a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of diamonds. She was draped in a gown that must have cost more than a mid-sized sedan, a frothy confection of blush tulle that seemed designed to take up as much physical space as possible. She laughed, the sound sharp and performative, as she gestured toward a group of socialites with a champagne flute. "It's about the brand, darling," Sienna said, her voice carrying easily over the soft quartet music. "The Sterling name needs a certain elevation. Some people are born to be the face of a dynasty, and others are just the background noise." She caught sight of Elena then. Her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her perfectly contoured cheekbones. She whispered something to the women beside her, sparking a ripple of muffled giggles before she began her approach. The click of her designer heels on the marble floor sounded like a countdown. "Elena," Sienna said, her tone dripping with a mock sweetness that set Elena's teeth on edge. "I'm surprised you found the time to change. I assumed you'd be buried in your little contracts until the very last second. Although I suppose a simple dress like that doesn't take much effort to throw on, does it?" Elena didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the documents in her hand, the legal blade she was about to unsheath. "Effort is often wasted on the unnecessary, Sienna. I prefer things that are durable." Sienna leaned in, the scent of her cloying, metallic perfume filling the space between them. "Durable is just another word for cheap. You look like a shadow in a room full of light. But don't worry, I've made sure your seat is tucked away in the back for the rehearsal dinner. We wouldn't want you ruining the aesthetic of the head table with your practicalities." A few guests nearby paused, their gazes flitting between the two women. The power dynamic was, to any outside observer, hopelessly lopsided. Sienna was the radiant bride-to-be, the future of the Sterling fortune, while Elena was the drab sister being tolerated out of obligation. "The head table is for family," a voice intervened. Richard Vance stepped forward, looking uncomfortable in a tuxedo that seemed to be wearing him rather than the other way around. He didn't look Elena in the eye. Instead, he placed a hand on Sienna's arm, a gesture of alignment that felt like a physical blow to Elena's chest. "Sienna is right, Elena. This night is about the union of two great houses. Let's not make a scene with your stubbornness." "I'm not making a scene, Father," Elena said, her voice level and terrifyingly calm. "I'm simply observing the architecture of this union." "Good," Valerie Thorne added, appearing from the crowd like a shark sensing blood in the water. She adjusted the heavy gold necklace at her throat, her eyes scanning Elena with clinical disdain. "Because tomorrow, once the papers are signed and the Sterling assets are integrated, there won't be room for any more of your observations. You've had your fun playing the protector, but the adults are taking over now." Elena watched them, the trio of greed that had spent years eroding her mother's legacy. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play whose ending she had already rewritten. She reached into her clutch, her thumb brushing the embossed seal of the arbitrator's office. "You're right, Valerie," Elena said. "Tomorrow, everything changes." The arrival of Maximilian Sterling broke the tension. The billionaire patriarch moved through the room with a gravity that silenced the idle chatter. He was a man who valued precision above all else, his silver hair swept back from a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite. He nodded curtly to Richard and Valerie, but his gaze lingered on Elena for a fraction of a second, a look of sharp, unreadable curiosity. "The catering staff is ready," Maximilian announced, his voice a low rumble. "Marcus, are we prepared to move to the dining hall?" Marcus Henderson stepped out from the shadows of the arched doorway. The venue manager looked impeccable, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but as his eyes met Elena's, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap was set. The legal standing of the Thorne family was currently hanging by a thread they couldn't even see. "Everything is in order, Mr. Sterling," Marcus said. "The arrangements are exactly as discussed with Ms. Vance." Sienna let out a small, derisive snort. "Discussed with Elena? I hope you didn't listen to her too closely, Marcus. She has a habit of overcomplicating the simplest things with red tape." "I found her input to be foundational," Marcus replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Sienna rolled her eyes and turned back to the room, clapping her hands to gather attention. "Everyone, please follow us into the hall. Tonight is a celebration of the Thorne Sterling future, a future where we finally leave the past behind." She led the procession, her tulle skirt billowing behind her like a cloud of smoke. Richard and Valerie followed close behind, their heads held high, already imagining the taste of the Sterling billions. They walked with the confidence of people who believed they had already won, unaware that every step they took was bringing them closer to the edge of a cliff. Elena stayed back for a moment, watching the parade of vanity move toward the grand dining hall. The sound of their laughter echoed off the glass walls, hollow and fragile. She felt the cold condensation on a glass of water she'd picked up from a passing tray, the chill grounding her. She wasn't a shadow. She was the darkness that preceded the dawn. As she began to walk toward the hall, she saw Maximilian Sterling standing by the entrance, his arms crossed. He waited until she was within earshot. "You're very quiet tonight, Elena," he remarked, his eyes narrowed. "Usually, a senior arbitrator has a great deal to say when there's this much at stake. I find that the most important things don't need to be shouted, Mr. Sterling," she replied. "They only need to be proven." Maximilian studied her for a long moment, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I look forward to the proof, then. I've always preferred the truth to the aesthetic." He turned and entered the hall, leaving Elena at the threshold. Inside, the Thorne family was already seated at the head table, basking in the glow of the candles, oblivious to the fact that the very ground they sat upon had been legally dissolved an hour ago. Elena took her seat in the back, just as Sienna had demanded. From here, she had the perfect view of the entire room. She watched as Sienna stood up, tapping her crystal glass with a silver spoon to begin her toast. The countdown had reached 0. The sun was about to set on the Thorne family, and Elena Vance was the only one who knew that the lights were never coming back on. The crystal clink of the silver spoon against the glass rang through the ballroom like a funeral bell, though only Elena Vance seemed to hear the finality in it. Sienna Thorne stood at the head table, her silhouette framed by a dozen flickering candelabras that cast a golden, deceptive glow over her silk gown. She looked every bit the princess she believed herself to be, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested she was looking down on the very air she breathed. "Family," Sienna began, her voice amplified by the hidden speakers until it coated the room like honey. "They say it's the foundation of everything, but as the Thorne family prepares to merge with the Sterling legacy, we recognize that some foundations are built of granite and others, well, others are merely the dust we sweep away to make room for greatness." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the back of the room where Elena sat in the shadows of the service entrance. A ripple of suppressed titters moved through the front tables. Valerie Thorne leaned toward Richard Vance, whispering something that made her father chuckle weakly and nod. his eyes carefully avoiding the daughter he had sidelined for a decade. The air in the room was thick with the scent of overbloomed peonies and the heavy, cloying perfume Sienna favored, a fragrance that cost more than a month of Elena's rent. "To my sister, Elena," Sienna continued, her smile sharpening into a blade. "Thank you for joining us in your understated attire. It's a poignant reminder of how far the rest of us have come. But tonight isn't about looking back at those who couldn't keep up. It's about the future of this estate." Sienna raised her glass high, waiting for the room to join her. But the expected chorus of cheers never came. Instead, the heavy oak doors at the side of the hall swung open with a thud that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. Marcus Henderson walked in, his expression as rigid as the legal clipboard he carried. He didn't look like a man arriving for a celebration. He looked like an executioner. Behind him, 2 security guards in charcoal suits flanked the entrance, their presence immediately souring the celebratory mood. "Miss Thorne," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence without the need for a microphone. "I'm afraid I have to interrupt." Sienna's smile didn't vanish. It simply froze. "Marcus, whatever this is, surely it can wait until after the toast. We are in the middle of a Sterling family event." "That's the issue," Marcus replied, stepping into the light of the head table. "It isn't. As of 58 minutes ago, the Thorne family's lease and access rights to this property have been terminated for cause. Specifically, the failure to disclose pending litigation and the fraudulent use of Sterling collateral." The room went so silent that the hiss of the candles became audible. Maximilian Sterling, who had been watching the exchange with the detached curiosity of a judge, slowly set his glass down. He looked at Marcus, then at Elena, his brow furrowing as the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. The color drained from Sienna's cheeks, leaving her expensive foundation looking like a gray mask of cooling wax. Her eyes, usually sharp with calculated malice, stretched wide until the whites showed all the way around her pupils, giving her the frantic look of a trapped animal. Her mouth hung open, a silent O of disbelief, as her lower lip began a fine, uncontrollable tremor that ruined her perfectly lined pout. Her posture, once stiff with the pride of a queen, wilted as if her spine had suddenly turned to water, her shoulders sagging forward while she gripped the podium so hard her knuckles turned a sickly, translucent white. Valerie Thorne gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she stared at the legal documents Marcus began to distribute. Richard Vance looked smaller than ever, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed purple as the guests at the surrounding tables began to whisper. The sound was like a nest of disturbed hornets, sharp, stinging, and relentless. "This is a mistake," Valerie hissed, though her voice lacked conviction. "Richard, tell them." But Richard said nothing. He was looking at Elena. Elena stood up slowly, the movement graceful and deliberate. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She walked toward the head table, the sound of her modest heels on the marble floor marking the rhythm of the Thorne family's collapse. "It's not a mistake, Valerie," Elena said, stopping just before the podium. She looked at Sienna, who was still trembling, the champagne in her glass sloshing over the rim and staining her white silk gloves. "You spent so much time worrying about who belonged at this table, Sienna, that you forgot to check if you still own the table itself." Elena turned to Maximilian Sterling and offered a small, professional nod. "The arbitration is complete, Mr. Sterling. The Thorne assets are frozen, and the venue is cleared for your private use. Without them." Maximilian stood, his gaze sweeping over the horrified Thorne family with a cold, final judgment. "Thank you, Elena. I believe it's time for our guests, our real guests, to move to the terrace." Sienna tried to speak. A choked, pathetic sound caught in her throat, but Elena was already turning away. She didn't stay to watch them be escorted out. She didn't stay for the pleading or the inevitable tears. She walked toward the exit, the weight of the past 10 years finally lifting from her shoulders, leaving the Thorne family to the silence of a room that was no longer theirs. The silence that followed Elena's declaration was heavier than the music that had filled the ballroom moments ago. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of the industrial air conditioning, and the distant, rhythmic clinking of silverware from the kitchen staff who had frozen in place. Sienna Thorne didn't just fall. Her entire composure seemed to dissolve. The carefully curated mask of porcelain perfection shattered, leaving behind a frantic, blotchy mess. Her eyes, once sharp with calculated malice, stretched wide until the whites showed all the way around, darting like a trapped animal. Her mouth hung open, her lower lip trembling so violently that her teeth clicked together, a frantic, rhythmic sound that betrayed her total loss of control. The blush she'd applied so meticulously now looked like bruises against her sudden, deathly pallor, and a single, ugly streak of mascara began its slow, black descent down her cheek as the first choked sob broke through. She looked less like a bride, and more like a ghost haunting a wedding that no longer existed. "You can't do this," Valerie Thorne hissed, her voice cracking as she stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She reached out as if to grab Elena's arm, but Marcus Henderson stepped between them, his hand resting firmly on his radio. Valerie's face twisted, the skin around her eyes tightening into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "We raised you. We gave you a roof when you had nothing, and this is how you repay us, by stealing a young girl's wedding day. You're a monster, Elena, a pathetic, jealous little girl playing at being a judge." Elena Vance didn't flinch. She felt the cool weight of the velvet arbitration folder in her hand, a physical anchor against the storm of Valerie's screeching. The scent of expensive, cloying lilies, the flowers Sienna had insisted on importing from Holland, seemed to turn sour in the air. "I didn't steal anything, Valerie," she said, her voice a calm, low vibration that cut through the older woman's hysterics. "I simply stopped paying for the theft you've been committing for a decade. This venue, the catering, the dress Sienna is wearing, it was all funded by the Vance estate, my mother's estate. You didn't give me a home, you occupied mine." Richard Vance finally found his voice, though it was thin and reeked of the cowardice that had defined him for years. "Elena, please, think of the family. Think of the scandal. Maximilian, surely we can reach an understanding. This is just a misunderstanding between sisters." Maximilian Sterling didn't even look at him. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, his gaze fixed on the middle distance with the detached boredom of a man watching an insect struggle in a web. "I don't have sisters, Richard, and I certainly don't have time for families built on fraud. My son's marriage into your house is officially under review by my legal team. Given that the Thorne name is currently synonymous with insolvent, I suggest you find a way to vacate this property before the local news arrives. I believe I saw a camera crew near the gates." The mention of the press sent a fresh wave of panic through Sienna. She clutched at her white lace skirt, her knuckles white. "The press! No, they can't see me like this. Dad, do something, call the lawyers. Tell them she's lying." "There are no more lawyers for you, Sienna," Elena said, stepping closer. She saw the way the catering staff were already beginning to clear the untouched appetizers, their eyes averted in a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. "The Thorne accounts were frozen 45 minutes ago. Your credit cards will be declined by the time you reach the valet. And as for your followers," she nodded toward the phone Sienna was still clutching, "I'd put that away. The truth tends to be very bad for engagement." Marcus Henderson cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. "The transport is waiting at the side entrance. For your privacy, I suggest you use it. Now." Valerie turned her rage on Marcus. "Do you have any idea who we are? I will have your job for this. You're just a glorified doorman." "I'm the man holding the keys to the building you no longer have a contract for," Marcus replied, his voice devoid of emotion. He signaled to the 2 security guards flanking the doors. They stepped forward, their shadows long and imposing across the polished floor. As the guards began to usher the Thorne family toward the exit, Sienna turned back one last time. Her face was a ruin of makeup and desperation. "You think you've won? You're still just the quiet little mouse who does everyone's paperwork. You'll always be alone, Elena." Elena watched them go, her heart rate steady, her breathing deep. She felt a strange, hollow lightness in her chest, the kind that came after a fever finally broke. She turned to Maximilian Sterling, who was watching her with a newfound, sharp-edged respect. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone professional and final. "You handled that with a remarkable lack of sentiment, Elena," he noted, his eyes scanning the now-empty ballroom. "Most people would have stayed to watch them cry." "I've spent 10 years watching them," she replied, tucking the folder under her arm. "I don't need to see the ending to know how it goes." She walked toward the main entrance, her footsteps echoing with a solitary, powerful rhythm. As she passed the long banquet tables, she saw her daughter's favorite stuffed rabbit sitting on a side chair, a small piece of home they had tried to take from her. She picked it up, the soft fur a stark contrast to the cold marble of the Thorne Empire. Outside, the evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. She didn't look back at the grand pillars or the flickering lights of the ballroom. She climbed into her modest car, the engine turning over with a reliable hum. As she pulled away from the gates, she saw the silhouette of the Thorne family standing by the curb, surrounded by their luggage and the wreckage of their vanity, waiting for a ride that wasn't coming. Elena checked her watch. She had 20 minutes to pick up her daughter from the sitter. There was a lot to explain, but for the first time in her life, she had all the time in the world. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the new lease she'd signed that morning. A small apartment, modest and clean, and most importantly, hers. She drove into the night, the lights of the city blurring into a streak of gold, leaving the silence of the ballroom far behind. The reckoning was over, but the silence was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the Sterling estate had slammed shut on the Thorne family's ambitions, and the world had not stopped turning. For Elena Vance, it had simply started turning in a different direction. She sat in her new office on the 42nd floor of the Lexicon building, the morning sun glinting off the glass-topped desk that bore only her name. There were no family photos of people who didn't love her, no clutter of someone else's expectations. Just the quiet hum of a high-end air filtration system and the scent of fresh, dark roast espresso. She smoothed the front of her charcoal gray blazer, a tailored piece that fit her like armor. Her hands were steady as she reviewed the final merger documents for Sterling Global. She wasn't just an arbitrator anymore. She was the consultant Maximilian Sterling called when he needed the truth stripped bare. A soft knock at the door preceded Marcus Henderson. The former venue manager looked different without the frantic energy of the wedding season weighing him down. He wore a relaxed navy suit and carried a folder that smelled faintly of old paper and justice. "The final transfer of your mother's estate is complete," Marcus said, sliding the folder across the desk. He leaned back, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. Valerie tried to contest the signature one last time. Her lawyer dropped her the moment the check for the retainer bounced. Elena felt a sharp, cold prickle of satisfaction, but it was tempered by a lingering ache. "And the house?" "Sold at auction 3 weeks ago," Marcus replied. "Maximilian's group bought it. He's turning the Thorne property into a sanctuary for at-risk youth. I think he enjoyed the irony of putting a foundation for the undeserving on the very land Valerie Thorne spent 20 years trying to gate off." He paused, his gaze softening. "I saw Sienna yesterday, Elena." Elena's pen paused over the signature line. She didn't ask, but Marcus knew the silence was an invitation. "She's working the returns counter at that department store on 5th, he said. "The one where she used to have a personal shopper. I was there picking up a gift for my sister. She didn't see me at first. She was arguing with a customer over a coupon for $5 off a toaster." Elena closed her eyes for a second, picturing it. Sienna Thorne, the woman who had once poured wine over Elena's dress because it wasn't designer enough, was now tethered to a polyester uniform, begging for a commission on small appliances. The public image Sienna had cultivated with such ferocity, the filtered photos, the tagged luxury brands, the curated arrogance, had dissolved like sugar in the rain. Without the Vance name and the Sterling connection, she was just a girl with a mountain of credit card debt and a resume that listed socialite as her primary skill. "How did she look?" Elena asked, her voice a low, steady vibration. "Hollow," Marcus said. The tan is gone. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, stressed bun. When she finally looked up and recognized me, her face, it didn't just fall, it shattered. She went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray in seconds. Her jaw physically dropped, and she started fumbling with the scanner, dropping the customer's receipt twice. She couldn't even meet my eyes. She just kept staring at the floor, her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to disappear into the linoleum. Elena nodded slowly. The face slap hadn't been a physical blow, but a slow, agonizing realization that the world she had looked down upon was now the only world she was allowed to live in. Later that afternoon, Elena walked toward the parking garage, her heels clicking a rhythmic, confident beat against the pavement. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a familiar number, Richard Vance. He had called every Tuesday for the last 4 months. He never left a voicemail. He just let the phone ring, a digital ghost haunting her peace. Elena knew where he was, living in a cramped, one-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city, working as a junior clerk for a firm that used to fear his name. Valerie had left him the moment the bank accounts were frozen, fleeing to her sister's house in Ohio, leaving Richard to drown in the wreckage of the life they had built on lies. She looked at the screen until the ringing stopped. This was the cost. Justice wasn't a clean break, it was a jagged tear. She had her mother's legacy back, she had her career, and she had her daughter's future secured. But she had lost the father she thought she had, replaced by the weak, broken man who had stood by and watched her be humiliated for a decade. She climbed into her car, the interior smelling of leather and the lavender sachet her daughter had tucked into the side pocket. As she pulled out into the stream of city traffic, she passed the department store Marcus had mentioned. Through the tall glass windows, she caught a fleeting glimpse of a woman in a navy vest, head bowed, scrubbing a smudge off a display case. Elena didn't slow down. She didn't honk. She simply turned her gaze forward, toward the modest, sun-drenched apartment where her daughter was waiting, and drove into a future that was finally, indisputably, her own. The vault was open, the secrets were spent, and for the first time in her life, Elena Vance was breathing air that didn't taste like someone else's permission.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.